Still short. Every single morning, still short. All right, so just to recap from yesterday, we talked a little bit about what it means to be called by Jesus, what it means to be called the light of the world. We talked a little bit about what it means to be called by Jesus to be sent into the world to love. We talked about baptism. We talked about who the light is. The light is not the emperor, right? We talked about who the Father is. The Father is not the emperor. I was talking to my colleague and friend, Zhenya Gurina Rodriguez. She's from Russia and moved here to do a PhD program and then married Edwin Rodriguez. So you can imagine the life story that she has. And we were having lunch this week, and I was talking about what I was going to say about these kind of imperial things, and she says, "Those titles were taken." And I said, "Yeah, those titles, that's right, those titles were taken." And Jesus comes and moves them and gives them to you, gives them back to God. We talked about that it's all y'all's light who's called to shine into the world, and that it's called to shine for the whole world, not just for some, but for all. And we talked about how we in the church, in the great inhale and exhale, are sent out into the world then to be Christ to our neighbors. Okay, got it? So we're going to be a little bit more focused this morning, and we're going to go a little bit different direction, but I know we can do this. So the theme, what happens here doesn't stay here. I think it's worth thinking about then. So where does it go? Right? If it doesn't stay here, then where does it go? The short answer is that it goes out, right? It goes out beyond ourselves and goes out into the neighborhood. So let's start this morning, and we're going to sing the two other verses of This Little Light of Mine song, the ones about what happens after the light leaves us, right? So John's going to start, play it through once, and then we'll sing these two verses. Oh, Bishop says you're supposed to stand. Okay. Our appreciation to John. So where does it go? It goes out everywhere we go, but specifically it goes out to the neighborhood. The light that God plants within us, the candle that is handed to us at baptism, goes out into the world. It goes into the neighborhood. And here's the thing, when you go into the neighborhood, there's already people there, right? This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where it gets complicated, because when we leave and we go out into the neighborhood, then we have to deal with other people. So we're going to think about and talk about the neighborhood today. Every congregation has a neighborhood. Every ministry has a neighborhood. Every business has a neighborhood. And I think ministry happens more effectively when we have a good sense of what our neighborhood is. Who are our neighbors? I want you to take a minute and share with somebody near you how you would describe or characterize the neighborhood of your congregation or your ministry site or your community. If you're a chaplain, your hospital, right? What is the neighborhood that surrounds, how would you describe it, that surrounds your ministry? Go for it. There's nothing there at all.
Nothing going on except a bunch of crazy white people.
Yeah, that's right. That's what's there. And God has them too.
He does. He absolutely does. The funniest thing is obviously when we talk about I took it into my soul. And she goes, and he just
That's very high praise from him.
it's awesome.
Thank you. I also think about how our neighborhoods are getting I mean, we're out and about as well, but like around here, within environmental institutions.
That's right. That's the question I'm looking at. That's exactly the question I'm looking at.
Good.
Great stuff.
Thanks. All right, 1 minute. I find this to be such a great exercise because I love to hear people talk about their neighborhoods. I love to hear people get animated and excited when they talk about the people that they know in their communities. That goes for any size community, it goes for any location of community. When you ask people about themselves, they light up. When you ask them about who they are, where they live, what they do, what they love, they light up. So I love this exercise, and I think it's important for us to do every once in a while as we're figuring out our ministries and we're moving around in the world. What does our neighborhood look like? How has it changed? What if it doesn't look like it did 15 years ago or maybe even 5 years ago? What is our response then to the neighborhood that's around us? Every congregation, every household, every business has a neighborhood, and that is where the light is called to go out. If we're going to talk about neighborhood this morning, though, I think we have to consult two experts. One's going to be Jesus, and the other is going to be Mr. Rogers. Yes. So I would actually, John's here, so we're going to sing. And if you don't know this song, humor the Gen Xers in the room and try, because the Gen Xers grew up sitting in empty living rooms singing the song to the TV. So we're going to sing Mr. Rogers' neighborhood song this morning. Yes. He's played it through once. Now we're all going to sing together. Ready? It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Would you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be since we're together, we might as well say, could you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Thank you. I will pit Lutherans against anyone. We can sing. We can do it. So Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood recently celebrated an anniversary of 50 years since the beginning of the show. And there was a documentary last summer that came out that I went and saw. I would have seen it anyway, but I took my kids, right? And we had a great time, and we also cried a lot. It was a beautiful documentary, and it got me really thinking about the impact of Mr. Rogers and this sense of neighborhood for my generation and for people older and younger than I. And so last fall at my Congregation for Adult Education, we did a whole series on Mr. Rogers, and specifically we talked about theology and Bible in that show. Now, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is not a faith-based show. I'm not claiming that at all. But Fred Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He was a reverend. And as I started to watch his show, I saw so much theology. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it was beautiful, and it was sophisticated, and it was so much more than I ever realized when I was growing up and watching him in my empty living room. And we had these amazing conversations, and so I thought I needed to share at least some of them with you today. Mr. Rogers was born in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, like where they make Rolling Rock, yeah. And he lived out his ministry, went to seminary, was ordained, lived out his ministry doing the show at WQED in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The statue that you saw with our Greta looking up at him, that's in Pittsburgh. And you know, in Pittsburgh, there's those three rivers that come together. Can you name them? The Monongahela, the Allegheny, and the Ohio. Right there at that point across, next to Heinz Field, where the Steelers play, is Mr. Rogers. And that statue sits there, and he looks up at the city with that open posture, that teaching, that sense of compassion. And I often think about what he would say to us sitting there now. Mr. Rogers went home to heaven not that long ago. And so celebrating the 50th anniversary of the show is bittersweet because we have lost him. And yet he left so much of himself for us that it's pretty amazing to engage. So a couple of things before we start. You know, Mr. Rogers, one of the things I loved about his show, and they talked about this in the documentary, his show broke a lot of rules. It was boring. Like, it was seriously boring. He once set a timer on a table and said, "Let's see how long a minute is." Seriously, because he was trying to teach kids about time. This is the most boring show you've ever seen. There's very low tech. There's not a lot going on. There's puppets, right? And even when I was growing up, there was a certain level of tech that was expected. And he broke all the rules. It wasn't about that. And yet he was on TV for decades. He connected with people across thousands of miles. There was something in the sincerity of what he was doing and the personal connection that didn't need any of that stuff. That is not to say that he did not work hard. In fact, he's known for being quite meticulous and prepared, and everything was done according to plan. He was highly professional, but it was personal, and there wasn't a lot of other stuff to get in the way. I wonder if we in the church could learn something from this. That sometimes we get so worried about having the next thing, whatever it is, and if we don't have it, we won't be effective. Well, Mr. Rogers was effective. The other thing that's interesting about Mr. Rogers to me, as a scholar of masculinity, is that he kind of broke a bunch of rules about what it means to be a man in America, right, or the Roman Empire. Kind of pick your poison. They're sort of the same, right? Mr. Rogers, in his sweaters knitted by his mother, very kind, very gentle, very soft, always talking about feelings. Anybody uncomfortable yet? Talking about feelings. We have this sense in our culture that there's this binary, I'm not a big fan of binaries, this dividing line between masculine and feminine, men and women, that men think things and women feel things. And I think that's actually underestimates both men and women. But Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, his currency was in emotions and in feelings. And so he sat there and he felt things, and he asked you what you felt about things. An image of the neighborhood, maybe. I love that about him, and one of my favorite things that he did when he talked about feelings is he talked about when we live in denial of our feelings, or we squash them, or we shove them away, or we say, I don't have time for feelings, or I'm not allowed to have feelings. When we do that, we end up lying to ourselves. So we did this whole thing on truth and freedom. And he said, but what if I could know the truth and say just how I feel? I think I'd learn a lot that's real about freedom. I'm learning to know the truth. I'm learning to tell the truth. Discovering truth will make me free. Thank you for the sermon on the Gospel of John, Pastor Rogers. Knowing the truth, and the truth will make us free. That kind of vulnerability in the world, which is another expression of masculinity, but not one that tends to be dominant, is one of the ways that we live in the world together and engage one another. And that breaking of the rules, we think of Mr. Rogers as such a straight-laced guy, but breaking all of these rules means he had a unique voice. He had something different to say. And so, as we think about the neighborhood, we think about Mr. Rogers, his gospel, the thing that he was trying to get people to understand, was never supposed to stay where it was. It was always supposed to go out. It was always supposed to be out in the neighborhood. It was always supposed to be in the living rooms of the children. And it was supposed to leak out to the parents. It was supposed to somehow teach the parents how to be better parents, how to engage their children. And he gave them the language. I like you just as you are. You matter. Maybe we can learn something. So where in the world did he get this idea about the neighborhood to begin with? I would say the only other person who's that much more of an expert on neighborhood, which would be Jesus. So now we're going to talk about Jesus for a few minutes. I'll take the slide. Luke's Good Samaritan. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Next slide. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So some things to point out here in the Gospel of Luke. It's not that the other Gospels don't have the first part of this story. They have a version of this story. But Luke pairs it with the story of the Good Samaritan. He wants to put these pieces together. Luke, every gospel has its own little flavor, own little voice. And a lot of times Luke is really interested in travel, getting from place to place. And he's interested in money, economics. What does it cost? And so this story has both of that microcosm in it. Everybody's always on the move in Luke. It's kind of like my husband would fit in there because he's always going somewhere, right? He's always visiting someone. He's always going to a congregation. This is what it feels like to be in the Gospel of Luke. Everyone's always on the road somewhere. They're going. They've left somewhere else and they're going to a new place. And that can be a dangerous place to be, especially in a story like today. And you'll notice that whole third slide of the story contained the amount of effort and money that it took for the Samaritan to take care of the man, right? So caring for others and providing for their physical needs is expensive and it's time-consuming. So Luke wants us to understand both the movement that's in this story, and then he also wants to draw attention to the economics, the finances that are part of this story. The man asks a question, we are told, in order to test Jesus. What he's testing him about exactly is not clear, but it's clear he's not coming as seeking counsel from Jesus. So he asks him what he has to do to measure up to God's expectations. Jesus turns it back on him, and the lawyer responds with their shared heritage. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is one of the rarer stories in Scripture where we don't have to guess at the motivation of the speaker. Luke tells us the next thing that the guy says is to justify himself, to explain so that he comes off looking good. He wants to be told that he's done enough, that it's hard out there, that I know you have a lot on your plate, and the little bit that you're able to do will be just fine. He wants to be told that some people are just kind of hard to accept, and you've helped the people closest to you, and I mean we're supposed to take care of our own first. And that's not what Jesus says. Jesus launches into the story about the Samaritan. Now, if you've ever been to church and you've heard this story, then you kind of know this drill. Jews and Samaritans were just enough alike to know how they were not alike, and so there was no possible way for them to get along. Maybe you know people like this in your life. That they had sort of a shared religious heritage, but not practice and not theology now, and not even worship location. So there was a big divide, enmity between the two groups. It's hard for us to understand this because, does anybody here have a grudge against Samaritans? I don't really have a grudge against Samaritans. I just don't. But I do have grudges, I confess to you. And if you were to look at my social media feed or the news organizations that I choose to spend my time reading or seeing, then you would know who my enemies are. Maybe the same would be true for you. We may not understand what Samaritans are, but we understand what enemies are. The people that we do not trust. Those are the people, if you have them in your heads right now, those are the people that Jesus calls good. So in a way, it's an offensive story because there's a good reason for distrust between Jews and Samaritans. There's a good reason for distrust between you and your enemies. You disagree. You may even have hurt one another in the past. There are things in your story that are not easy to overcome. There's enough hurt to go around. It's never that our concerns are unfounded. It's that Jesus asks us to love anyway, despite the fact that our concerns are well-founded. So given the divided society that many of us experience, it's easy to assume that Samaritans aren't just different from us, they're bad people. They're not worth helping. We are shocked that the Samaritan would help the man for two reasons. First, the Samaritan is not the helping kind of person. He's a bad guy. He's the other side. And because, in the reverse situation, we're not sure we would help the Samaritan because we're not sure he would deserve it. So the story offends us in this way. So much for a beautiful day in the neighborhood. I'll have the next slide. We have maybe an image of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood as being utopia, that everybody's really smiley all the time, and the puppets are happy, and they're singing, and then there's construction paper and cardboard, and then, beautiful things happen. But actually, I don't think that's, as I've done extensive research on Mr. Rogers, that's not actually what I've seen. In the very first week of the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood Show, which I learned from the documentary and subsequently verified for myself, do you know what happens? So King Friday the 13th, in the neighborhood of make-believe, this is, Mr. Rogers calls him the last benevolent despot. King Friday the 13th, who runs his neighborhood around him, there are new people who want to move in and they want to make change. And King Friday the 13th gets very angry about this change. So he decides he's going to cut off his community from the outside world, the changers. They sing the song, down with the changers, we don't want anything to change. He creates a registry in which people are going to have to write down their names, and they need to be known in order to get into the neighborhood. And then, in the next episode, after everything escalates, he builds a wall around the neighborhood of make-believe so that the outsiders who are different and bring change can't get in. This is the first week of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. The whole thing doesn't end until the outsiders send in messages that say things like kindness and peace and coexistence. So then they take down the wall. King Friday the 13th learns a lesson, and they try again. They try again to be a neighborhood. Far from being utopian or naive, I think Fred Rogers had hung around church people. I do. I think he had met church people before. And sometimes, in certain circumstances, we can be like this. But I don't think it's just a church person thing. I think it's a human thing. That the idea of difference, new people, people in our neighborhood who might introduce change or who are simply not like us, cause us to want to create a registry or to build a wall. And so Mr. Rogers touches into this human, very basic human instinct in children and tries to get them to move beyond that into seeing one another as a neighborhood. As we used to say in the old LBW baptism service, we are children of a fallen humanity. Mr. Rogers recognizes and loves that fallen humanity and calls it into neighborhood. While he dealt with crayons and balloons and music and construction paper, he also talked about divorce and the death of Bobby Kennedy and the death of animals. He talked about really complicated things in his show because he was trying to explain them in a way that would demystify them for kids. Because the unknown is scarier than the known. The known can be scary, but if it's unknown, it's even scarier. So he spent his time trying to explain and to live into what it actually means to be a neighborhood, all of its complications and all of its conflicts. It sounds like ministry. It sounds like the kinds of things we're called to do with our light when we go out into the world. Next slide. One of the parts of the show I remember the most is Mr. Rogers just visiting his neighbors to see what they do. Let's go see so-and-so. He goes to a shoe store to visit with a business person. He goes to the clinic to see the nurse. He goes to the crayon factory to see how they make them, and fortune cookies and things like that. He goes and visits musicians and performers practicing on stage. He goes to see writers writing. He showed interest in what other people are and what they do, and he valued it. Each of us can do this. Each of us does this. And we don't do it just because we're good people. We do it because we got the candle, right? We got the light that was given to us in baptism. This is not complicated, but it's difficult. It's really hard to sit with somebody and focus completely on them. It's part of the thing they teach you how to do in seminary because it doesn't come naturally to us. We want to talk about ourselves. But engaging someone else about themselves, that's where the magic happens. I recently learned this thing about the difference between a shift response and a support response. New York Times article, so not academic. But the difference between a shift response and a support response. So what this means is I say to somebody, I'm so stressed out. I am tired and I'm very stressed out. And the other person says to me, oh, I know. I am too. Let me tell you about everything that's going on with me. And while we might think that that's like a commiserating thing, it also shifted the energy, right? From the person who, I started telling the story, it shifted it to the other person. That might be okay in an ordinary circumstance, but it also happens when we say things like, I'm really worried about my mom. She's really sick. And the other person says, I know, I felt just that same way when. A support response, on the other hand, is to say, how does that make you feel? We all learned this in CPE. How does that make you feel? We as people of Jesus, we as the neighborhood creators, we follow someone like Mr. Rogers in engaging people who they are. We're not conversational narcissists. We are people with support responses to the world. Mr. Rogers was excellent at the support response. These visits, they didn't just demystify things for kids, they showed children that everyone is worthy of engagement and honor. They showed that every form of labor is worthy of respect. He showed that other people are worth listening to and getting to know. So just a couple of these pictures on them. On the left is Jeff Erlanger, a little kid who was in a chair, and Mr. Rogers had him talk about his chair. I posted this picture on social media not that long ago, and a friend of mine who's a rabbi said, Jeff was a fixture at my Jewish camp growing up when I would go to outdoor ministry. Isn't that amazing? In the neighborhood. And then on the right, that's Yo-Yo Ma, arguably the most famous cellist, if cellists can be famous, I don't know. Yes, cellists can be famous, yes. So that's Yo-Yo Ma and Mr. Rogers, and in the middle is his son, whose name is Nicholas Ma. And Nicholas was on the show to play with his father in an episode when he was this age, and then he was on later when Mr. Rogers was talking about how people grow. And what's really interesting about that is that Nicholas Ma was not really a musician. I mean, he had to play the piano, but he's not a musician. And Fred Rogers thought it would be really good for kids to see a child playing an instrument with a parent, especially one that's really professional. So Nicholas agreed to play in this really supportive environment. And he later, in an interview, said those are the only 2 times he ever performed with his father. That's it. In the neighborhood. Because Mr. Rogers told him that he will be glad he did, and that this was a way of building a relationship with his father. So Nicholas Ma's gift was not music. Nicholas Ma's gift was film. And so when it came time for Nicholas Ma to focus on a documentary, guess who he wanted to honor with that documentary last summer? Fred Rogers. Because Fred Rogers had honored him. This is the neighborhood. This is the hard work and the investment, but it's also the payoff. The other photo I want to show you is the second one in from the left, and that's Francois Clemens. Francois Clemens was the police officer in the neighborhood, and there are many interviews with Francois Clemens. You can Google him and watch. Francois Clemens was not only African American, but also gay. And he was a part of the neighborhood for decades and was the police officer. And in an era in which African American people were not represented on TV, let alone in positions of authority, he was the authority figure. He was the one who was the officer in the neighborhood. Mr. Rogers, man, breaking all the rules, yeah? And this thing was not an accident, what they're doing right there. It's a hot day in the neighborhood of make-believe, and they're sitting there, and they have a kiddie pool, and they're sitting there together with their feet in the water. This was during the era in the United States when people were throwing acid into pools to chase African Americans out of pools because they didn't belong in pools where white people would swim. So Fred Rogers and Francois Clemens sit together in the kiddie pool in the neighborhood. And he even, at one point, Francois says, "I don't have a towel." And Mr. Rogers says, "That's okay, you can use mine." And he dries his feet. Did anybody go to Maundy Thursday? I did. And so did Fred Rogers. The neighborhood is full of conflict, but it's also full of opportunity to engage one another. I love this quote from Fred Rogers, the bottom of this slide. "Love isn't a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun, like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and right now." Being a part of the neighborhood is challenging. The great exhale of the church into the world is difficult. It's beautiful and it's singable, but it's hard. And it does no good to pretend otherwise. If we're actually going to engage the neighborhood that's around us, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some sacrifice on our part. And it's going to take decentering ourselves in the conversation and listening to the experience of somebody else. It's going to take revisiting some of our assumptions about how we thought the way the world worked and listening to how it works for somebody else. It requires humility. To engage the work of understanding racism, gender and sexuality, ethnicity, economic status, it requires humility. And we will be changed. We will not be the same as when we begin. But we do it anyway because it's worth it to honor the humanity in all of God's children. Next slide. So what happens to us when God loves us is never meant to stay there. It's meant to be shared in the neighborhood, and it draws us outward. This made me think of when Paul talks about neighbors in Romans. So I wanted to put this little piece together for you as well. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, and shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Or as Fred Rogers would say it, love is at the root of everything. Love, or the lack of love. We know what it's like to live in a world with a lack of love. We know what it is not to be loved, and we know what it is to be around people who are not loved. The light of the world, y'all, are sent in the world to do something different from that. You're sent in the world to engage the neighborhood, to listen, to ask questions, to be in relationship with those that God loves. Okay, next slide. So we're going to go back to Luke now, and this is really important because there's a shift in the story from the beginning into the end in the question that's asked. My dissertation director has many famous lines, but his most famous line, the one that stuck with me, is the questions you ask determine the answers you get. So spend time on the questions, or you're going to have to go back. The questions that you ask determine the answers that you get. The first question that's asked in the story, when he stands up and he wants to justify himself, that's what he's trying to do. He says, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answers that question by having the story of the Good Samaritan. And that's a good question. It's not a bad question, because we need to be pulled out of our own minds, or maybe our own belly buttons, as Luther would say, right? And Incurvatus say, like moved back out into the world. So the question, who is my neighbor, is a good question. It makes us look at our people around us and decide, right? Who is my neighbor? Of course, the problem is with that question, eventually we start to think that maybe we get to decide who our neighbors are, and we do it based on who's more lovable, who's easier to engage with, who's easy to give to because they say thank you. Like, we suddenly become the arbiters of deciding who our neighbors are, so therefore who we have to be kind to, who is deserving of my love and struggle in the world. At the end, the question has changed. Jesus doesn't ask that about neighbors. Jesus asks something completely different. Look at this question. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor? There's a shift here that goes from me evaluating everybody else to me looking in the mirror. And no longer am I asking the question of who deserves my love and struggle. The question is, how loving am I? How much struggle am I engaged with? The focus becomes on the person doing the loving, and how that person becomes and stays a loving person, completely not dependent on the identity of the one who's being loved. It doesn't matter who I encounter. The expectation is that I will be a neighbor. And I can work on that no matter who I am in relationship with. It's a subjective focus, an orientation on y'all. How are we loving, struggling neighbors to the world in which God calls us? So in the course of a lot of this whole thing, I've watched a lot of episodes of Mr. Rogers. And after one of his many visits with people, he sat down in his living room and he looked at the camera and very sincerely he said, I'm going to read this because I want to get it right. Do you know that the only way to be really happy is to find ways of helping someone else? And once you've found those ways, to do them. I love our Lutheran doctrine of vocation, but this one's pretty good too. Do you know that the only way to be really happy in the world is to find a way to help somebody? And then don't just figure it out, actually do the thing. That's what the question of who is a neighbor is trying to get at, because each of us will do this uniquely. You will do this the way that you have been gifted to do so in your baptism. There's nobody like you. You are special. As Mr. Rogers would say, you are valued. And so the way you do this will fit you. It'll fit your neighborhood. It'll fit your personality. But it is part of the baptismal call. It's not complicated, but it's challenging. Life, at least the life of faith, I think, is the exploration of what we're called to do, how we're called to help people. And if the people that we encounter don't yet know what they're good at, that's the church's job. And if the people we encounter don't yet know that they're valuable and they have gifts to share, that's the church's job. We are called into the neighborhood to be Christ. It's not complicated, but it is very difficult. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love the neighborhood. Be the loving person without waiting for it to deserve the love. Why? Because that's how God decided to love you, without waiting for you to be deserving of the love. God starts. God calls you. God creates the neighborhood. And we all enter then, loving the Lord our God and our neighbors as we love ourselves. Amen.